Today, we're going to talk about the 1970s. And no, not just disco and bell-bottoms. We're diving into the story of how two massive energy crises didn't just create long lines at the gas pump. They literally rewrote the rules of the global economy. This is a story that created a legacy policymakers are still grappling with right now.
You know, it's kind of hard to imagine now, but back in the early 70s, a little bit of inflation wasn't seen as a big deal. It was almost expected. Just a normal side effect of a growing economy. Policymakers really felt like they had it under control, that they could just nudge it up or down whenever they needed to. Oh boy, were they about to get a rude awakening.
So what happened? What was the event that took this little, manageable problem and turned it into an absolute economic nightmare? Well, the answer is a wild story of war, revolution, and a really painful lesson in what happens when people stop believing you.
Okay, so let's get into it. And you might think this story starts with an oil rig or a tanker, but it actually doesn't. It begins a few years earlier with a single decision that basically set the entire global financial system adrift on the open ocean.
See, for decades after World War II, the world ran on something called the Bretton Woods system. It was the bedrock of everything. It provided certainty. Basically, the US dollar was as good as gold, literally, and every other major currency was tied to the dollar. It was stable, it was predictable.
But by 1971, things were getting shaky. The US was spending a ton on the Vietnam War and on domestic programs, and it just couldn't keep that promise anymore. So President Nixon did something pretty stunning. He just cut the cord. He announced the US dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. And just like that, poof, the world's financial anchor was gone.
And this new, unanchored system, well, it was about to get its first major test just 2 years later, and it was a big one. In October of 1973, war breaks out in the Middle East, and in response to the U.S. supporting Israel, the Arab members of OPEC did the unthinkable. They weaponized oil. They just turned off the tap. They embargoed exports to the U.S. and cut production, hitting America right where it hurt most, its growing addiction to foreign oil.
The impact was not subtle. It was immediate, and it was staggering. We're not talking about a gentle price increase here. The price of a barrel of oil quadrupled, 4 times higher, in just a few months. That shockwave hit every single corner of the global economy.
And this shock unleashed a brand new kind of economic monster, something economists actually thought was impossible. You had prices soaring. That's inflation. But at the same time, the economy was grinding to a halt and unemployment was rising. They had to invent a whole new word for it, stagflation.
So what was the reaction? Well, basically, panic. The world's industrialized nations were terrified of being this vulnerable ever again. So they quickly got together and formed the International Energy Agency, or the IEA, to coordinate and build up strategic oil reserves. The world sort of limped through the rest of the 70s. But if that 1973 crisis was a punch to the gut, the second shock in 1979 was a total knockout blow. And this time, it wasn't just about money or oil prices. It was deeper. It was a crisis of belief.
The trigger, this time, was the Iranian Revolution. As chaos engulfed the country, Iran's massive oil fields went offline, cutting global supply by what sounds like a pretty modest 4 to 5%. But here's the thing. In a market that's balanced on a knife's edge, that was absolutely catastrophic.
Oil prices more than doubled again. And just look at this chart. In the US, inflation, which was already a huge problem, just went vertical. It blew past 13%. There was this feeling that the economy was completely spinning out of control and nobody was at the wheel.
And this is the really crucial part. The crisis stopped being about oil and started being about psychology. People just stopped believing the prices would ever come down. So workers demanded higher wages, companies raised prices to pay for them, and it just created this vicious, toxic spiral. The Federal Reserve had lost all credibility.
This kind of desperate situation called for a truly radical response. It was a crisis of credibility that could only be met by a man of absolute, iron-willed discipline. Enter the new Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker.
Volcker's plan was nothing short of revolutionary. He got up and basically said, we're done trying to gently guide interest rates. From now on, we are going to attack the money supply itself. And that meant he was going to let interest rates go as high as they needed to go, no matter how painful it got. He was going to intentionally cause a recession to crush inflation. And how high do they go?
The Fed's main interest rate peaked at over 19%. Just let that sink in for a second. 19%. This wasn't a gentle tap on the brakes. This was slamming the car into a brick wall. This was shock therapy.
And the medicine was absolutely brutal. Volcker succeeded in plunging the U.S. into a deep, painful recession. Unemployment shot above 10%. Farmers, small business owners, home builders, they were all devastated. It was carnage. But it worked. The back of inflation was finally broken.
But the shockwaves from what Volcker did, they didn't stop at the U.S. border. This brutal cure in America created a brand new, and for many, a very painful reality for the rest of the globe.
Think about it. Those sky-high U.S. interest rates acted like a wrecking ball for developing countries. Nations all across Latin America had borrowed tons of U.S. dollars when rates were low. All of a sudden, their debt payments exploded, triggering a massive wave of defaults and kicking off what became known as the lost decade. So the world that came out the other side of this crisis was playing by a totally new set of rules. For central banks, credibility became everything. Their number one job, their sacred mission, was to kill inflation. And the memory of the 70s, that trauma, would shape almost every major economic decision for the next 40 years.
And the lessons from that time still echo today. Back in the 70s, as one person famously put it, OPEC had us over a barrel. The U.S. was dangerously dependent. But today, well, because of policies born directly from that crisis, like creating a strategic petroleum reserve, and because of a huge domestic energy boom, the U.S. is now actually a net exporter of oil, a completely different world.
Which leaves us with this one final and kinda unsettling question. The Volcker shock worked, sure, but the price was a devastating recession. In our world today, a world that is swimming in government, corporate, and household debt, all way, way higher than in 1979, could we even afford to take the same medicine if a crisis like that ever struck again? That's the uneasy legacy of the shocks that reshaped our world.